Welcome to the Oregon Problem Gambling Positive Culture Framework webinar for March 1st. Today we have both Katie Dively and Jay Otto with us with Montana State University with the Center for Health and Safety Culture. We are having a webinar today on data collection process. So good morning, Jay and Katie. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This is wonderful. Catch up on the project. Katie and I and our entire team have been both busy and effective working on this project, so we're very excited to share some of the work we've been doing and dive into aspects of the data collection process. As I think many of you know, Katie and I and others work for the Center for Health and Safety Culture, and just to quickly reconnect with us, we're within the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. Although we're in the Western Transportation Institute, we work on a lot of other issues besides transportation, but that is one of the issues we work on. And we're very excited to be working on this project around problem gambling. At the center, we do a research, but we also think it's absolutely critical to do training and guidance to bring what we learn out to the field. And so this is, and all of our projects, all of our work is very applied. All of our sponsors are working on real projects where they really want to move the needle, and this is a great example of a project where we're really trying to address problem gambling in the state of Oregon. So quickly, what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about some of the core questions that we identified that we want to answer with the data that we collect, the survey process. We're then going to walk through some of the constructs that we want to use to measure those. We'll reconnect. I think you've had some background on the behavioral model, but we're going to reconnect with that quickly because that really provides the structure that we use to design the survey. We'll then talk some about the methodology we're going to use to collect responses, and we'll have an opportunity at the end to have some question and answers. So that's basically what we're aiming to do here. As you all, I think most of you are aware and had from the training, we organize our work around a framework, and we call it the Positive Culture Framework. And this helps us just guide us in terms of what our next steps are. So just overall in this project, we're really at the step 2 phase where we're looking at assessing culture. And this is the primary role to start to understand what are some of the beliefs and the existing cultural factors, which is at the bottom of the green arrow, that exist within Oregon around this issue of problem gambling, engaging with resources on problem gambling. And this, by understanding this, it really helps us see then what we need to do in terms of messaging and other forms of communication or intervention to grow the beliefs, ultimately to grow the behaviors that we want, which is very much around engaging in active ways to address problem gambling. And that could look like contacting the OPGR's website or other resources, or for those folks who need it, engaging in treatment and things like that. So it's valuable for us just to reconnect with the big picture and the framework to understand where we are in the process. So as we think about assessing culture, I think it's good to look at, and this is what we did, is we examined some of the data that were already available through other survey work, which is routinely done as a part of OPGR's work. And so we were able to gather results from the relatively recent survey that just gives us a sense of the nature of the issue, the level of problem, the prevalence. And so from the recent survey, we have about 2.6% of Oregon adults experiencing moderate or severe problems with gambling. And when we look at 2.6%, we can think that's a really small number. But I also like to look at that in the context of, like, how many people is that? So that's about 84,000 people. That's a lot of people. So while we can have a sense that 2.6% is small, 84,000 is certainly not small. So that is impacting a huge number of folks. When we expand that out to experiencing low-level problems with gambling, That's at about a little over 5% in about 174,000 people. So that's a lot of folks. And then when you start looking at some of the numbers, and these are a little bit dated, but in terms of folks who've been engaging with some of the resources and programs, yet about 134 families or significant others got support. So not necessarily for themselves. I mean, they weren't necessarily the individual addressing the gambling behaviors directly. It wasn't their own behaviors, but they were supporting somebody who was. And about 1,100 gamblers enrolled in publicly funded programs, gambling problem, that should be funded problem gambling treatment programs. And we don't know, from those folks who may be engaged privately with either through private insurance or through private counseling. So there could clearly be more. But still, it's helpful to look at this and see that, with that order of about 1,100 folks engaging in treatment programs and about 84,000 having a potential diagnosis with moderate or severe, there's a big gap there. So there's certainly, when I start to look at that, I see, wow, there's tremendous opportunity to grow and help more folks access those resources. And we have to think about that in the context, it's still 2.6%. It's a relatively, it's a low prevalence. It's sort of on a big picture scale, it's rare. So this notion is we're really going to want to try to expand the people who can help, really expand the engagement with accessing resources to beyond just the individual themselves, but also hopefully reach the people that surround that individual. And I think Katie's talked some about this notion of bystander engagement, but you can see it becomes extremely important here because sort of reaching that, finding those 2.66% is a little bit of a needle in a haystack. And so how can we expand the group who's helping us identify those folks and helping those folks get help? Well, that's that whole notion of increasing that bystander engagement. So you'll see that coming up as we move forward and we look at some of the questions and things we're examining with the survey. Ultimately, what we see is the role around step 2 is where we're going to identify cultural factors that we want to grow that will increase use of problem gambling resources. So it's really about helping folks identify that there's a need. It could be identifying the need for themselves or for others. And then if I identify that need to address a potential problem, what do I do? How do I know to take the next step? And so being able to bolster the beliefs, the shared beliefs, which we call those cultural factors, bolster those cultural factors or beliefs that are going to lead to those behaviors of engaging on getting help. So that's the sort of at a very high level, the big picture, what we wanted to assess. The core questions, we would like to narrow it down even more. So sort of what questions do we want to be able to answer after we've collected the survey results? One is we need to assess how concerned are people about problem gambling behaviors. If somebody can't recognize a behavior as being potentially problematic, they may not be concerned about it, and therefore they're not going to be in a position to either take action for themselves or for somebody else. So we're going to want to look at that. Can people assess that a certain behavior is problematic and identify that? And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to do that. We're going to look at doing that using some vignettes, some stories. To what degree do people have perceived stigma about problem gambling? And how does perceived stigma about problem gambling potentially get in the way of or impede some of their beliefs or behaviors about engaging in then protective action? So we want to be able to look at that and see what role stigma is potentially playing here. Are people in situations to intervene with a potential problem gambler? So can folks, are we seeing that folks can identify problem gambling behaviors amongst others? And is that somebody who is potentially a family member, a friend, or a coworker, somebody that they could have interaction with? So, are those folks seeing those behaviors in others and the potential to intervene? And if they are in those situations, how often are they actually intervening? Are they actually doing anything? So we want to learn about that. And then the big chunk of it is going to be really what are their attitudes and beliefs that predict accessing resources. And it could be accessing resources for themselves and also accessing resources for others. So all of these are core questions that we want to be able to answer after we've gathered the data. So this really informed how we designed, structured the questions. So our approach to looking at and assessing people's concern for problem gambling behaviors, we drafted 5 vignettes. Another team member, Carrie Finley, who actually has a treatment background, drafted 5 vignettes. They were they're written as like a story about Jane or Jay or anybody's name, and they describe the behaviors that person is engaging in. They were written based on sort of backing up from the DSM criteria around a diagnosis. We then took those 5 vignettes and we had them scored by OPGR counselors to sort of say, would you consider this, how would you rate somebody's potentially problem gambling behaviors here on sort of a diagnostic level. And that was very helpful, so we could see, were the vignettes accurate enough? Were people being able to assess a concern there? We created vignettes at different levels of concern, so they're not all at a high level. We did a couple high, I think 1 or 2 moderate, and I think 1 where there isn't a diagnosis of problem gambling. And so what we're going to do is have the respondents read those vignettes, and then we ask them 3 questions after each vignette. So how concerning is Jay's gambling behavior if Jay was the character? How concerned would you be if Jay was a close friend or family member? Sometimes people have a higher degree of concern if it's somebody who they care about. So we wanted to sort of tweak that first question. And then just sort of asking it in a slightly different way. Do they think something should be done to address Jay's gambling behavior? So we will ask those 3 questions for each vignette. And that's going to give us a sense of, can folks do they generate a degree of concern for situations that involve problem gambling? So that's going to be very insightful, really help us understand how the ability of folks to even have a level of concern. We're going to use an existing scale that's been validated by other folks about perceived stigma about problem gambling. So when we can, we like to use existing scales. It just bolsters our reliability and validity. And what this scale does is it asks people to what degree they think most people would have this belief. So it's not necessarily that they believe it, but whether they think most people would have it. So for example, I believe or don't believe most people think problem gamblers are liars. So there are actually 13 statements that are asked, and the person rates each one of those statements on a 4-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then we'll average those across those statements and helps us give an overall scale or score about that individual's perception of stigma around problem gambling. With that score, and what we would call as a scale, with that scale, we'll be able to then do correlations with lots of other responses that they give on the survey to see whether folks with a high perceived stigma answered differently than folks with a low perceived stigma. And how did perceived stigma start to influence those issues? And that'll be helpful so that it'll help motivate how much what are some of the levels of stigma out there, and how is stigma interfering with engagement with protective behaviors? And then that'll help us sort of how much do we need to address that issue. Then the remaining questions are really designed around a behavioral model where we're trying to assess various beliefs that are leading to behaviors, particular behaviors around engaging on either addressing taking the next step on my own problem gambling behavior or someone else's. And so that's what we're going to really focus on in the behavior. Now, this is a very simplified behavioral model. This is actually the behavioral model that we use when we're designing the survey. So we have developed a series of questions that will seek to measure each one of these boxes. And then we'll do various statistical analyses to show how the measures in each of the boxes were related to their overall willingness and intention to speak up or engage with resources. And then we'll also compare that with their engagement, their actual behavior in terms of engaging with accessing supportive services. But now we're going to quickly walk through and show you the kinds of questions. We won't go every question because there are a lot, but we'll give you a sense of the kinds of questions that we're asking for each one of these boxes. And you'll see on the screen, there's a version of this behavioral model that'll be in the upper right-hand corner with a little arrow showing you where in the model we are as we walk through and seek to gather information about each one of these what we would call a construct. So the behavior, what we want to really explore is have they visited the OPGR website or engaged it through texting or through calling, either for themselves or for someone whom they were concerned about. We also asked a number of other behaviors that they may engage in, for example, asking somebody else for help, maybe limiting their access to money, actually engaging in treatment. So we focused on these three behaviors as well as others. And so we want to have a sense of, are people doing that if they're concerned about themselves? Have they done any of that in terms of if they were concerned about somebody else? So that'll give us a sense as to what degree folks are engaging with some of those resources. We'll then back up in the model, and this is where we ask about willingness and intention. And this is important to ask because maybe some people didn't engage in that behavior because they simply weren't in a circumstance where they needed to. Maybe they don't gamble and nobody they know that gambles. So here we want to expand our understanding to sort of say, if you were in a situation where you were concerned about somebody, how willing would you be to do these? And that's the notion of willingness and intention. It just expands the conversation or the context a little bit bigger to more of a hypothetical, and that gives us a better understanding of being able to predict people's potential behaviors. So we'll look at their willingness and, in essence, their intention to visit the website, to text the resource, or to actually make the call. And we'll look at it in a variety of different social settings. So for themselves, if they were worried about themselves, if they were worried about a family member, a partner, a spouse, basically somebody very close to them, a close friend, and then D is sort of moving out to an acquaintance or a coworker. And I imagine what we typically see is that we'll see a variation in their response by social distance. They typically are less likely to do it with an acquaintance or coworker. They may be much more likely to do it with a family member. We'll see how they interact in terms of even doing it for themselves. Sometimes folks are actually more protective of others than they are for themselves. So we'll look at that as well. But that gives us a deeper understanding as we look at some of these social dimensions as well. Then we'll look at attitude. We're going to assess their attitude about contacting the OPGR. And we're going to look at it in the context of doing it if they were concerned about somebody else's gambling behaviors. That's a little bit easier. Sometimes folks are, as I said, they're more comfortable intervening on somebody else's behalf than their own behalf sometimes. So, and because the survey is already going to be kind of long, it's difficult for us to ask about both. So actually asking about whether they do it for somebody else is a good proxy. We also know, because again, we go back to that basic data, about 2.6% of the population is experiencing engaging in problem gambling behaviors. We really want to grow a positive attitude about contacting OPGR by a much larger population so that we can get those folks who are surrounding them to take steps. So this broader lens is really important. The way we'll assess attitude is we use 10 pairs of words, and we'll ask people to rate where they feel their attitude is about contacting OPGR on a scale all the way from, let's say, an example of a word pair is that it would be useful to do or that it would be useless to do. And so we have 10 pairs of different words, and they'll rate them, and then we'll actually average the rating across the 10 pairs, which gives us an overall sense of whether it's a positive attitude or a negative attitude. In addition to that, what tends to inform attitudes are behavioral beliefs. These are beliefs about positive and negative expectancies about engaging in the behavior, as well as some assumptions about problem gambling. And we actually, right now, we have 24 questions we'll ask about that, and we'll ask their level of agreement with those statements. And that is a lot of questions. But on the initial, what we do, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, is we do pilots first, and we make the pilots very long, and then we narrow them and shorten them up as we go through. But the initial pilot will be very long. We'll do analysis and see if we can reduce that number of 24 questions. But that an assumption could be like problem gambling can't be treated. So if somebody has that belief, we want to see, one, do a lot of people believe that? And how does having that belief influence their attitude about contacting? Maybe they have a sense like there's nothing you can do about it, so there's no reason to contact anybody. I mean, what's the point? And so those are kinds of things we want to discern from asking those questions, and we do that then through some additional analyses. We will also ask about prototypical image. This is a form of a normative sense, and it's a sense of like, how do they feel about somebody who would contact OPGR if they were concerned about somebody else's gambling behaviors? Would they feel sort of, is that a good thing to do? Is that kind of person admirable, or is that kind of person not admirable? And we actually use, again, we'll use word pairs. I think we have about 8 or 9 word pairs that we'll use that give us a feel, and that's helpful because one, we want to see if they have, in particular, if they have a negative prototypical image of somebody who would intervene. That's definitely something we're going to need to shift. And if they have a positive prototypical image about somebody who intervenes, that can really guide some of our media development and that how we sort of portray the intervener in some of the media that gets developed and some of that. So it's valuable for us to start to see how they perceive this kind of typical person who might intervene. Then we'll move into perceived norms. We'll examine 2 kinds of perceived norms. We'll examine the injunctive norm and the descriptive norm. The injunctive norm is a perception as to whether people think this is, that they should do this. So is this acceptable? Would other people oppose or support me? Would other people approve or disapprove? Is this something we should do? And so we'll explore that with a series of questions. We'll also break that down in sort of some of their normative beliefs. In particular, we'll ask them sort of like, do you think your spouse would be supportive? Do you think your best friends would be supportive? And other people like that. So we can get a sense of not only in general whether they think people would be supportive, but even certain groups of people, whether they would be supportive or not. And that, again, is very helpful for us if we find that this is important in terms of influencing their behavior. Then this is, again, something that we would promote in the media, and we would start to bring out that people do think it's acceptable. So we would create that social expectation that people should speak up. And bystander intervention, the research shows on bystander intervention, there's certain things we need. We need people to have a level of concern for the behavior. We need people to, in general, it's recognized that people need to have a sense that it's okay to speak up. In other words, they'd be supported by others. And the third one is they have a sense of what to do. So this helps them with that sense of being supported by others. Then we will also look at perceived descriptive norms. And this is whether they think other people would actually do this. So do they think this is typically done? And that'll be interesting to see. This is also another one that also comes up as a predictor. This can lead to messaging that sort of, most people do speak up if they're concerned about somebody else. So this is another way, again, to create some social pressure to encourage and foster bystander engagement. We'll then also look at perceived control. This becomes very important on a behavior like this. And this is basically whether people feel like they can do it. Often on bystander intervening, we found that people often have positive behavioral beliefs and a positive attitude about intervening. They're like, yeah, I think intervening would be good to do. It would help the person. They have normative beliefs in that they'll say like, oh yeah, I think people should intervene. I almost feel like I'm responsible to intervene. But often when we get to perceived control, this is where they'll sort of say, but I'm not comfortable doing it, or I don't know what to do. And this will lead people to not then engage in the behavior. So it becomes extremely important. So we'll sort of look at, do they have a sense that they're capable of, and that's a typo, I apologize, it should be capable of contacting OPGR, not contracting, it should be contacting. Their sense as to how easy or difficult it is, and really how comfortable are they doing it. And that'll give us an overall sense about their perceived control. We'll also look at some specific control beliefs, much more specifically, how comfortable would they feel like visiting the website? How comfortable would they feel taking a next step like engaging in a text conversation or even an oral conversation by calling? And that'll be important. We'll also ask them just some basic knowledge, like are you aware of this, of the resources? Because we may find that people just don't know about the resources, so we have to do some basic education. So there's a lot that can be captured under perceived control, and we'll be really interested to see. This will really very much guide the development of our intervention. What do we need to teach people to do? How do we need to be able to, what skills do we need to grow? How do we help people understand this? So perceived control becomes very important. We will collect some demographics so we know who takes the survey. We'll ask them to identify the region in Oregon where they're coming from, their age, their sex, education attainment, and race. It's not so much that we'll look at breakdowns by those. It's more that we want to see we've got a good representation and cross-section of folks. We might look at some comparisons and just to see are behaviors significantly different between males and females, or do we see things vary based on age or education attainment? That might help us inform certain subpopulations we might want to focus on a little bit more than others. We're not going to have probably high enough distributions of a variety of different races to make many conclusions about different races. And in general, we want, when we develop media, we'll make media very broad and very accessible by, we want it to be diverse and representative. But it does help us just get a sense of who's participating in the survey. So we'll gather those kinds of demographics. The methodology, when we start looking at how are we going to do this, so we will engage in a development process. We will do, right now we're budgeted out to do 3 pilot tests. This will be with a convenience sample of about 100 adults. They will be from Oregon. We will recruit them online. We have a partner, we use a service called Qualtrics, which can obtain panels of people to take a survey. And so for these pilot samples, we'll get a diversity of age. We'll get about a 50-50 split on sex. We'll try to get some diversity across the state as well. But what we're really looking at is just to get a good number, and 100 allows us to do some good statistical analysis. We'll then go into the survey and we'll examine, do we have any ceiling or floor effects? That's where everybody answered a question either at one end of the answer stem or the other end of the answer stem. So if everybody answers a question at one end or another, we don't really learn anything from that. So that means we need to go back and redesign the question or redesign the answers so that we get some variation from people responding. We'll then also analyze all of the scales to see how well are the scales holding up. Do they have strong internal reliability? We'll do some factor analysis to see are they lining with a consistent underlying component. We'll then build out some of the models and we'll see how the various components correlate with one another, and we'll do some preliminary regression analyses to see how is the model holding up. After that initial pilot test, we'll probably seek to remove some questions. We'll find that certain questions didn't add any new information, that another question we'll often ask multiple questions, maybe 5 questions, and maybe we only need 2 to really get what we need, and the other 3 were actually redundant. So we'll seek to narrow the number of questions down, and then we'll do a second pilot test. And we'll basically do that exact same activity again, and then we'll try to narrow it down. Sometimes we add additional questions if we find that something isn't holding up well. So sometimes we'll add new questions. And if we need to, we'll do a third pilot test. And each round of pilot tests will be with different people, but it really allows us to have a good sense of how well the survey is sort of performing internally before we launch big time. Then what we do for implementation is we'll be recruiting about 300 respondents. Hopefully we can get a little bit more on that. When we're originally doing budgeting, we have to estimate costs, and really cost comes down to the length of the survey. We'll use a similar style of panel. They'll be recruited online. These will be folks who are age 18 and older who live in Oregon, and we'll really seek to stratify it by age, sex, and probably a degree of geography, so we know we have a good distribution across the state. This is not strictly a random sample because of this recruiting methodology that we use with this partner. However, they have a large number of people that they draw on. So we have found that in our work, the samples that we get tend to be pretty comparable to what we're seeing when we do random sampling. This is also just a lot more cost effective. So I think for what we need, this is going to serve us very well and give us a really good understanding, especially when we get up in the numbers of 300. And I would imagine we might be able to get a little bit more than 300, so that'll help us as well. So that's the basic plan. We hope to actually probably start pilot testing next week. That process actually can occur pretty quickly, especially with just 100 adults. So we will be going through this process cyclically, very quickly through March, with the goal of then moving towards full implementation towards the latter part of March and early April. And then the full implementation doesn't take that much longer. The Qualtrics folks just go to a much bigger group all at once. And then we'll dive into the analysis and the reporting. So that's a little bit on the methodology. So I know I've been speaking fast and going through this very quickly. I'd be more than happy to go back and talk about any of the components or anything in depth or any other questions around this. But that's pretty much the core content that we wanted to share with you this morning. Katie, is there anything I missed that you want to add in?
Thanks, Jay. No, nothing that you missed that I am aware of.
Okay, great. Roxanne, did we have any questions get texted in or anything like that we want to address, or do we want to open up the phones?
I'm not seeing any questions right now. Certainly an opportunity if anybody has anything to go ahead and enter a question for us. If no questions are coming up at this point, which still not seeing any, it may be something that folks may need to ponder on a little bit, and if something comes up, they can get back to me and I can send them on to you.
Absolutely. So yeah, just find your chat box and you can type the message in there as a way to send something in. But yeah, no, I mean, if there are no questions, that's fine. And certainly, like for me at least, I always think of the question half an hour after the presentation, so that's fine too. Yeah, just send it in to Roxanne and she can forward it to us.
Okay. We did just have one question come in about, are the participants being provided an incentive to take the survey?
Good. So there is a small incentive that is provided to them. We actually don't know the details of that because it's done through a variety of partners. Qualtrics engages then a whole bunch of other companies, but the folks are given a small form of compensation. Usually it's not cash. Usually it may be credits towards, I think some of the things they'll do is sort of credits towards which then they can earn up to be able to buy things on different sites or things like that. But it tends to be pretty modest, but they actually don't, they keep proprietary, they definitely tell us that they use incentives and that it's not cash, but they keep proprietary the details of those incentives.
Great, thank you. So, and just to kind of, you know, as this process has been rolling out, I mean, we now are into, we did a 6-month project and now we're into a 2-year project. One thing to keep in mind as this is moving forward is that all of this information that's getting gathered from the different surveys that have been done and questionnaires will then be pulled together and and then utilize to help us develop the toolkit, or help them develop the toolkit that we will be utilizing here in Oregon. To increase our awareness that gambling is an activity that carries risk, and then also hopefully point people toward the resources, and help provide some different tools that will help them engage either at the bystander level or other ways within their community. So this is all kind of this is one survey that is feeding into a lot of other information that's been gathered along the way. So
yes, great, thank you. And so what'll come out of this is we will gather all this data, and then we will create a statistical report, which is just a compendium of the responses to all the questions. And then we will also create a key findings report, which is where we really distill down what we felt was most important and capture that and provide that. We try to design that for example, a non-academic audience, so that they can really use that as a tool to foster conversations. And then we'll come back to you and do a webinar about all of this. So we'll have an opportunity to come back, share the results with you, go over those. You would have a chance to ask questions then. You would have a chance to ask questions after that. But we very much see that the outcome of doing a survey like this is to get that information back out to you, to other stakeholders, so that they can use that. I mean, it tends to be very interesting to see what people are thinking and what folks are doing. And sometimes just merely reflecting that information back can trigger change in stakeholders or other folks to sort of say, wow, this is, I didn't realize that, or we could help here, or something like that. So that is definitely the survey. There's a lot of work to it. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff, but I do want you to know that you will definitely get some concrete information, and that key findings report tends to be a valuable tool as well. And then we'll do the webinar. But then very much that will heavily inform how we design and include messaging on the messaging that we create, as well as the tools.
great, thank you. So we have not had any other questions submitted. So if there is nothing else for either you, Jay, or Katie to share with us, we will go ahead and end early and let folks get back to their busy days. So is there anything else you'd like to add, Jay or Katie?
I think I'm good. Thanks so much for all your work. We're really enjoying the project, and so thanks for your attention today.
Yes, thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for joining us all today, and we will have the recording from this webinar, and the PDF of the slide deck will be posted on the Oregon PGS site for your guys' listening and viewing pleasure at a later time as well. Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.